Hello everybody. The US presidential elections are just around the corner, Trump versus Biden. So I thought I'd use this video to contextualize and explain things a bit, give you a brief overview of the US political system, and talk about a couple of the peculiarities of that system that may well become relevant in the next few days. So let's get started. As you know, the US is a federal republic, as is Germany. That simply means that the states, there are 50 states in the US, grouped together and delegated numerous powers to a central or federal government. And what I'm going to be talking about today is only this federal government, although the state governments and local government retain numerous powers, for example, in policing or education, some kinds of taxation, etc. But let's stick to the federal government so things don't get too complicated. This government is organized according to rules set down in the US Constitution, which came into effect in March 1789. And although it's been modified on a number of occasions since then, these are the so-called amendments to the Constitution, we still basically have the same Constitution as was promulgated over 200 years ago. And the Constitution divides government into three separate branches. We have the executive branch, the judicial branch, or the judiciary, and the legislative branch, or Congress. So let me just say a couple of sentences about each of those branches, starting with the judiciary, because it's been in the news quite a lot in the last few weeks. So the federal judiciary consists of the Supreme Court of the United States, but also numerous other federal courts. But let's stick to the Supreme Court. There are 9 justices who are members of the Supreme Court, and their job is basically to decide on all matters that relate to the Constitution. So most obviously, they decide on whether laws are constitutional or not. That means quite simply that even if a law has been passed by Congress and signed by the President, the Supreme Court will still examine that law and decide whether it's constitutional, in which case it comes into effect, or unconstitutional, in which case the law is struck down and doesn't come into effect. Now, Trump has appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court, most recently Amy Coney Barrett, who's known as a very conservative judge based on her previous record. And this was controversial for 2 reasons. First of all, she's been appointed so close to a presidential election. Some people think that's unfair or inappropriate. And the second reason is, with her appointment and with Trump having appointed 3 justices, this means that there's a very clear conservative majority on the Supreme Court, 6-3. And more liberal left-wing Americans, many Democrats, are worried that the conservative bloc will use its powers to strike down laws, for example, concerning abortion rights for women, in reproductive rights for women in general. And on the other hand, more conservative, religious Americans, many Republicans, are hoping that the court will do exactly that. And this would mean that even if Trump loses the upcoming elections, this would be, if you like, his greatest legacy. There would still be this great conservative bloc in the middle of government, which might be able to stop the presidency or Congress moving in a more left-wing and liberal direction. So that's something to keep your eye on in the next couple of years. Then we have the legislative branch, whose job is to pass laws, fundamentally. And we have 2 houses. There's the upper house, which is the Senate. There are 100 senators, 2 for each state. Interestingly, Washington, D.C., the capital, isn't a state, so it's not represented in the Senate. Some people say that's unfair and an example of a democratic deficit. The other interesting thing is that the very big states, California, for example, have 2 senators, but so do tiny states. New Hampshire, Wyoming, places like that with a very small population. So the small states are overrepresented, and the idea behind that is to prevent the large states from dominating federal politics completely. Again, there are some who think that that's fair for that very reason, and others who don't like it. especially because the larger states, California, New York in particular, tend to be more liberal and left-wing, whereas many of these smaller states tend to be conservative in nature. So that gives the Republicans a kind of inbuilt advantage in the Senate. Senators are elected for 6 years. So it's a quite long-term position. And you can contrast that with the House of Representatives, whose members are a lot more members, 435, and they're elected only for 2 years, but they can be re-elected for as many times as they want. And unlike the Senate, the electoral districts for the House of Representatives are divided roughly according to population. So it's a different kind of representation, if you like. By the way, in terms of terminology, if you use congressman or congresswoman, then that can mean either a member of the House of Representatives or of the Senate. But as far as the Senate is concerned, you tend to talk more about senators. You can also use the term representatives for members of the House of Representatives. Now, for a law to pass, it needs to be passed by both houses. Even if both houses have passed a law, the president, as we'll see in a minute, can veto those laws. But the Congress can still pass the law, even against the veto of the president, if both houses can find a 2/3 majority for that. So as you can imagine, that happens very rarely. So in fact, there is a strong and meaningful presidential veto. The Senate has additional powers that the House of Representatives doesn't have, which is why it's in general a stronger and more prestigious house than the House of Representatives. For example, if the president names federal judges or judges to the Supreme Court, they have to be confirmed by the Senate, not by the House of Representatives. So then we come to the presidency itself. Of course, that's the central figure in the whole system, particularly for people like us who are living abroad, because he has decisive powers in foreign policy. He represents the US abroad. He signs treaties. He's the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. But as we said, his major power in internal US politics is this veto that we talked about. So no law can be passed except with this double 2/3 majority if the president is against it. And this gives him incredible powers to influence federal politics in that way. As you know, the president is elected for 4 years, and he can be elected for a maximum of 2 terms. So even if Trump wins the next elections, he would have to retire, if you like, after his next period in power. The executive branch also consists of the vice president, for example. Vice presidency isn't a particularly powerful position, but it's interesting in one particular way. If the president becomes incapacitated or dies, as was the case with President Kennedy, then the vice president takes over the presidency. And you may have heard speculation about Joe Biden's health. Some people have said that he's suffering from dementia or is just in general very old. This would mean, if it turned out that that was the case and he couldn't fulfill his 4 years as president, then Kamala Harris, who would be his vice president, would then take over the duties of president from him. So again, that's something to keep an eye on in the next couple of years. I mentioned a couple of peculiarities. I've already talked about the fact that in the Senate there are 2 senators for each state, regardless of their size. Another peculiarity is the very strict and clear separation of powers that we have between the 3 branches. Now, if you look at a country like England or Britain, that doesn't really have this separation of powers. So the Prime Minister, who's the head of the executive, is also a member of the Houses of Parliament, of the House of Commons, so of the legislative branch. Senior judges are also a member of the legislative branch of the House of Lords. So the 3 branches are somehow mixed up and interlinked. In America, that's absolutely not the case. The president isn't a member of Congress. The judges also can't be members of Congress. So there is this strict separation of powers. It's often referred to as a system of checks and balances. and it's to stop any one of these branches, the presidency, Congress, or the courts, from becoming too powerful compared to the others. If you look at it historically, America was founded at a time when England had a very powerful king, and they wanted to stop the president from being like the king was in Britain. So they decided that there would be a strong Congress and strong courts in the Constitution. Now, as far as the elections are concerned, there's one peculiarity to bear in mind in particular, and that's the fact that the president isn't simply voted on according to a system of one person, one vote. You may well know that in the last elections, Hillary Clinton got, I think, around about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, and yet Trump won the elections quite easily. Something similar happened in the year 2000. And that's because the president isn't elected directly by the people, but by so-called electors, Wahlmänner in German. Each state has a certain number of electors, and they cast their votes for the presidency, and it's based on these votes of the electors that someone becomes president or not. Now, some people say that's unfair for two reasons. First of all, there's no law that says that the electors have to vote in the same way as the people voted in their state. So theoretically, the people of Wyoming could vote 95% for Joe Biden, but the Wyoming electors, there are 3 of them, they could still vote for Donald Trump if they wanted to. That's considered undemocratic. The other problem is in terms of representation. Now, the bigger states do have more electors than the smaller states. For example, California has 55 electors and Wyoming has only 3. But in terms of the proportion of the electors to the population, Wyoming is strongly overrepresented and California is underrepresented. So I think if I get my statistics right, Wyoming is 3.5 times overrepresented compared to a state like California. So these two things taken together make the system very unfair. It leads to things like, for example, Donald Trump, he knows he's going to lose California, so he's not even going to campaign there. He'll concentrate his campaigning on so-called swing states where he knows he has a chance of winning, Florida, for example. And if he can concentrate on those few states and get the votes in these few states, it doesn't matter if he loses New York, California, and other states like that. Historically speaking, they had this system of electors as opposed to one person, or originally one man, one vote, to stop what they would have considered to be mob rule, the rule by simple people. They wanted this constraint, these electors, people who could be trusted to vote in a responsible way. And many Americans today would say that that's no longer necessary and no longer appropriate in a modern democracy. So again, let's see if and whether that system changes in the next few years and if it influences the election at all. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that overview. I hope you found it reasonably enlightening. And I hope you'll be able to follow some of the election night coverage in a few days. It's certainly going to be very interesting. And I do think Biden's going to win this time, but I think it's going to be a lot closer than many people think, or closer than the opinion polls suggest. Mustn't forget, last time it was absolutely certain that Hillary Clinton was going to win. She was ahead in the opinion polls, and still Trump actually won quite decisively when it came down to it. Let's see. Bye.